Space Force promised to give us a different Steve Carell than we saw in The Office. And not only that, but it gave us some references that are simply out of this world. Huh? Yeah, okay. I can't promise not to make any more space jokes, but I can promise to talk about some real-world events that were snuck into this fictional universe and reveal the fate of one character most of us forgot about. There's no shortage of entertaining characters on Space Force, but can we go ahead and talk about this guy from the first episode? He made the unfortunate decision to chat with General Mark Naird about the upcoming launch, and the next thing he knew, he was stuffed inside his trunk somehow. I guess Mark either really doesn't like to make small talk, or he was trying to protect the location of his base. It could go either way. Anyway, despite the fact that Mark gave the order to release him after the launch, it apparently didn't happen, because as Redditor Jeff12660 pointed out, we see a missing persons poster in the last episode with his picture on it. His name is, or was, Emmett Bunton, and he was last seen at Wild Horse gas station and convenience store. I theorize on where he could be, but frankly, it's pretty grim, and we have a lot more Space Force to get through.
There's a guy in the trunk. Hold him till after the launch.
You might need a solid grasp on theoretical physics to enjoy Rick and Morty, but you do not have to be acutely knowledgeable about our space program to appreciate this show. Although honestly, it helps, because there are a lot of references to real-life events, including one just a couple of minutes into the first episode. When General Kirk Grabiston tells Mark an area is only for 4-star generals, Mark asks if he forgot about his promotion, like he forgot to get competitive bidding for the AT-6B. This simple sentence was referring to the Air Force's light attack aircraft experiment, and the fact that they issued contracts for the finalists, including Textron's AT-6. General Naird has an admittedly cool job, but his promotion came with some major downsides, including his wife being imprisoned and his teenage daughter struggling to adjust. But forget about that, because let's take a moment to appreciate that Mark is basically Batman. And I'm not just talking about Steve Carell's strangely deep voice that he uses for the character. In the first episode, we see Mark entering the base, which is concealed from the outside and can be accessed through a door hidden in the mountain. It looks similar to the entry to Bruce Wayne's Batcave. And that's not all. In the same episode, Mark's told to expect a call on a secure phone, which we later see as a goofy-looking, bright red oversized cell phone, but it actually looks like a modern-day version of Adam West's classic bat phone. During the 4th episode of Space Force, we see Mark talking to Dr. Chan and says that he was once chased through the Bosnian woods by the entire Serb Third Army. It's a weird flex, and it's also most likely a reference to what happened to General David Goldfein. His F-16 was hit in the skies above Serbia, and he was forced to bail out under less than ideal conditions. Miraculously, Goldfein managed to survive despite the best efforts of his enemies, and years later, his ordeal was referenced on Space Force.
Hey, the camp! I'm heading to...
Most of us have dreamed about traveling to outer space, but just living under those conditions here on Earth can be enough to drive someone crazy. Just take a look at the 4th episode of Space Force, where Mark has to fill in for one of the people living in the mock lunar habitat. While he's there, he meets Jerome, who brought a unique item with him, a didgeridoo. This may seem like the kind of wacky thing you'd expect from a show called Space Force, but NASA has brought many instruments to space before, including a didgeridoo. Also, there really was a year-long mock Mars habitat experiment which took place in Hawaii, as well as some shorter ones in the same area. And in a truth is stranger than fiction twist, they brought along a didgeridoo. I would have thought that this move would be a didgeridoo, huh? But apparently not. This show starts out with a rocket launch taking place in May, which is something the actual Space Force really did in May 2020. According to Ben Schwartz, who plays F. Tony, they were writing and filming the show as the actual Space Force was announcing their projects. Of course, the show isn't a perfect matchup for the organization, but it's not trying to be. Co-creator Greg Daniels claims both Space Forces had the same jumping off point, but he considers the show a parallel universe version of its real-life counterpart. The reason for the X-37B launch is classified, and we also don't know if any convenience store clerks were harmed in the process, but hopefully that was made up for the show. In the 7th episode of Space Force, Mark talks about how the US Postal Service has issued a new Christmas stamp every year for the past 200 years. But Dr. Adrian Mallory informs him that the Postal Service was cut in order to make room in the budget for Space Force. Interestingly enough, the United States Postal Service is in pretty dire straits after losing money for 13 years in a row. In 2020, they declared that without any kind of intervention, they'll run out of funds in only 5 years.
That's great.
Fred Willard played the role of Mark's father, the appropriately named Fred Naird. Sadly, this legendary actor didn't live to see the show hit Netflix, since he passed away shortly before it was released on May 29th, 2020. According to his co-star Steve Carell, Willard was amazing to work with and improvised a lot of his dialogue, and after one take, the crew put down all of their equipment and gave him a standing ovation. Fred Willard being a talented treasure is hopefully something you've noticed before, but what you may not have realized is that this wasn't the first time he was on a show called Space Force. He once filmed a pilot for a doomed 1978 show of the same name, and it's probably for the best that it didn't get picked up. On December 20th, 2019, the United States Space Force was established as an independent branch of the US Armed Forces. And less than a month later, on January 16th, 2019, Netflix announced their Space Force series, co-created by Greg Daniels and Steve Carell. While this connection may seem obvious to some, actress Lisa Kudrow had no idea there was an actual Space Force. On the show, she plays Mark's wife, Maggie Naird, and said that she was drawn to the project because of the opportunity to work with Steve Carell, John Malkovich, and the rest of the cast. Kudrow says that she was embarrassed to have somehow missed the formation of an actual Space Force, and insists that she usually keeps up with current events. While Space Force may be real, it may also have less rights to its own name than the show. The series secured the Space Force trademark in Europe, Australia, Mexico, and more, while the Air Force has a pending application for registration inside the US. While this isn't a big deal at the moment, it could be later on if both Space Forces try selling merchandise. And speaking of branding, many fans have pointed out that the official Space Force logo looks an awful lot like the one from Star Trek. In the 6th episode, members of Space Force are surprised to see India launch a rocket with technology they'd been working on for quite some time. The Secretary of Defense insists that there must be a spy in their midst who learned about their technology, which sets off a mole hunt. On the show, the rocket takes off on the president's birthday, and if we're assuming the unnamed president in Space Force is real-life President Donald Trump, that makes it June 14th. On July 14th, 2019, India did try to launch their rocket, but stopped after encountering a technical glitch. The rocket ended up launching later on, and I wouldn't be surprised if this Indian ship is supposed to be a reference to the one in the show.
Please.
Since Space Force and The Office both star Steve Carell, it's understandable that fans try to compare the two, but it's safe to say that the Space Force offices are a major upgrade to the setup back at Dunder Mifflin. In the show, the base is located in Wild Horse, Colorado, but the exteriors were actually filmed at the California State University Dominguez Hills Theater Building. Production designer Susie Mancini said it took a lot of work to find a campus that resembled a military base, and interior shots had to be filmed on a soundstage. Since windows would take up a lot of valuable wall real estate, she decided to have most of the light come from above the characters, which also makes the environment look more severe and less warm and inviting. You might find this hard to believe, but the Pentagon didn't want anything to do with the creation of Space Force, and neither did NASA. The production team had to do a lot of research up front, and these organizations were apparently not very welcoming. But they did manage to bring in military advisor Max Vasquez, who helped them incorporate aspects of military life into the show. Susie said that they weren't going for 100% accuracy, but they wanted to make Space Force at least somewhat realistic. But when it came time to focus on outer space, they ended up getting help from private aerospace company SpaceX. As I mentioned earlier, Steve Carell stars in both Space Force and The Office. When he was the manager at Dunder Mifflin, there was nobody that he hated in the entire world more than HR rep Toby Flenderson. But behind the scenes, Paul Lieberstein was one of the showrunners from seasons 5 to 8, and he actually wrote an episode of Space Force 2. He wrote the penultimate episode, It's Good to Be Back on the Moon. So if you weren't a fan of that episode for whatever reason, you can feel free to pull a Michael Scott and blame the whole thing on Toby.
No! God, please, no! No!
There's something about outer space that tends to capture our imaginations. Many of us have dreamed of venturing out there amongst the stars, but Steve Carell prefers to stay on solid ground. In the 4th episode, we see Mark wearing a spacesuit, and apparently, it was not all that fun behind the scenes. According to Carell, it was incredibly uncomfortable, way too hot, and made it difficult to move his arms. When asked if he'd be interested in actually going into space, he said trying on even a fake spacesuit was enough to convince him that it's a bad idea. He said, quote, "Not a tiny bit of me would ever want to do that. I live in fear of doing something like that." End quote. Many fans watched the credits roll on the finale of Space Force wondering if they'd missed one major piece of information, namely, what Mark's wife Maggie did to end up in jail. When we first met her character, she was excited about the prospect of living in a fully staffed house thanks to her husband's promotion. And then the next thing we knew, she was in prison. During episode 6, Mark tells her that they should take a trip to the Grand Canyon when she's released, and she replies that it won't be for another 40 years. Usually that kind of time implies a serious crime, but co-creator Greg Daniels has confirmed we don't know yet what she did. He simply thought it would be funny to have Maggie in jail, and like the mystery of the audience not knowing what she did. Maybe it'll be revealed in the 2nd season, or maybe we'll find out when we finally get to see Frozone's wife. Sometimes it can be hard to separate fact from fiction, especially when this show's involved. It's no secret that it's a parody of the United States Space Force, but some of us couldn't help but wonder if that goes both ways. When the United States Space Force posted this recruitment video, a lot of fans thought that it was some kind of marketing for the show. It is a little bit over the top, so it's not totally surprising that it was mistakenly associated with the other Space Force. Plus, it's actually pretty similar to the scene in the 1st episode when Mark delivers an inspiring speech to high schoolers. Now let's take a look at some intentional parodies Space Force actually created. There's Ben Schwartz's character, F. Tony Scarapiducci, who's the social media director for Space Force. His name is a reference to political consultant Anthony Scaramucci, who briefly served as the White House Director of Communications, and I do mean very briefly, as in he lasted a whopping 10 days after his appointment on July 21st, 2017. When he joined the White House team, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus and spokesman Sean Spicer both quit in protest, but it turns out they could have just kicked back and waited a couple of weeks. Sometimes, procrastination is the answer.
Stupid, this is stupid, this is stupid.
Perhaps the most obvious and on-the-nose parody on Space Force is Anabela Ysidro-Campos, who's portrayed by Ginger Gonzaga. She is clearly based on politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest woman to ever serve in the United States Congress. Ocasio-Cortez has expressed her displeasure about the actual Space Force, but she's been understandably a little busy to comment on the Netflix show. In the 2nd episode of Space Force, the team needs to reattach solar panels to Epsilon 6, a task that's easier said than done. So Mark decides that the best man for the job is not a man at all, but rather a dog named Theodore and a chimp named Marcus. Animals in space might seem as wild as bringing a didgeridoo to the International Space Station, but there is a long history of launching non-humans into orbit. There have been fish, lizards, bees, and yes, dogs and monkeys who have been sent into space before. I'm hoping we learned what landed Maggie in jail in the 2nd season, but it seems like Greg Daniels has some bigger things on his mind. Creating the show alongside the actual Space Force was one thing, but now that the precedent for real-world events has been set, he isn't sure how far to take it. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic was a major event, but he isn't sure if he could fit it into the show. Daniels claims that all content creators are wondering how to incorporate it into their works, or even if they should. For now, he's thinking of holding off instead of trying to fit an entire pandemic into season 2, but he knows it's something that he may have to address at some point.
This is 10 trillion times louder and brighter.
Aspects of real life tend to find their ways into Space Force, but sometimes the opposite is true. Like when someone added a photo of Mark to an exhibit at the National Museum of the US Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It should have shown Chief of Space Operations General John Raymond, but the museum said it was just a joke among staff while the exhibit was being updated. Like many other aspects of Space Force, Wild Horse, Colorado is very real. It's just nothing like what you'll see on Netflix. It's technically an unincorporated village that's been sparsely populated since most of it burned down in 1917. None of the show contains footage from Wild Horse, which is home to a one-room schoolhouse, although it's not in use by the slightly over 50 people who live there. It is certainly private enough to make a convincing place for a secret base, but it's also much flatter than what we see in Space Force, so Mark would have to figure out another way to get to his Batcave. Office. We know that the Pentagon and NASA didn't want to get involved with Space Force, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any officials who are fans. General John Hyten is the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and in 2006, he was the director of Space Forces for the U.S. Central Command Air Forces. General Hyten says space is his passion, and he was excited when the Netflix series was announced. He hopes that it will bring people's attention to the importance of space exploration and show that it can be a complex and expensive endeavor. Even if you're not scientifically inclined yourself, you can see that a lot of research went into creating Space Force and incorporating actual events into the fictional world that it takes place in. But can we take a moment to appreciate a reference that is much more in my wheelhouse? In episode 8, Dr. Chan and Captain Angela Ali talk about the differences between Full Metal Alchemist and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Yeah, I know, right? Everyone knows Brotherhood was created after the conclusion of the manga and is therefore more faithful to the source material than the original series, although they both have their own merits and are worth watching.
One is Full Metal Alchemist, one is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, two different shows.
What do you think about Space Force? Is Steve Carell just playing Michael Scott again, or does this series manage to stand on its own? Before you launch, make sure to check in with us here at ScreenRant by clicking the subscribe button and turning on your notifications. We'll see you next time.